think we can be okay. I think we can begin. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome back to our book talk series here at the Center for Advanced American Studies at the Institute for International Studies at MGIMO University. And this is our first actually book talks in this new semester, and the way I think we decided to proceed was somewhat different from what we usually do. Usually we try to pick up an issue that is somewhat newsy and try to find a book that is, you know, and respective author who are best positioned to talk about this issue. This time it's somewhat interesting because we know it's pretty hot on the Russian Western front, and we decided to go the opposite way, even though many think it's somewhat related, and hope to hear people's thoughts on this issue. And we're talking today about Russian pivots to Asia and Russia's policy and the history of the Russian pivots to Asia and Russian policy in the East. And to do that, we are privileged to have our good old-time friend and colleague, Professor Chris Miller, and our colleague here at the MGIMO, Professor Anna Kirieva. Chris has authored a very nice and interesting and exciting book titled "We Shall Be Masters: Russian Pivots to Asia, East Asia from Peter the Great to Putin." And Anna is a renowned expert on Russian-Japanese relations and now Russian policy in the East in general. And just briefly, for those of you who don't know who our today's colleagues are, though I think these people are an overwhelming minority, because both people are well known to the Russian and international expertise. Chris Miller is an assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and co-director of the school's Russia and Eurasia program. And I think someone recently, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, is a Jean Kirkpatrick visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And Anna is our colleague, as I said. She teaches at the MGIMO, and she's also a research fellow at the Center for Comprehensive Chinese Studies and Regional Projects here at the MGIMO University. All right, our protocol has not changed ever since last time we met. Our speaker gets to talk for about 20 minutes, then preceded by comments and questions by the discussant. Then perhaps I'll pop in with a short remark and a question to our author, and then we open the floor to the Q&A. And thanks for being with us, and hope you enjoy our discussion. And with no further ado, let me turn the floor to Chris.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Max, for this introduction and the invitation to join you all today. And thanks in advance for Anna for the comments and for kicking off our conversation. Let me just say at the outset how excited I am for the Fletcher Schools and MGIMO's collaboration to continue. We're now after many years of working together, both in person before the pandemic and then over the past 2 years of virtual events. And I'm glad that this has been able to persist both through the pandemic and also given the complicated state of US-Russia relations today. I think this is an important channel for conversations between scholars to continue. So on a personal level, but also on an institutional level, I'm grateful for the invitation and hopeful that conditions will permit some of my colleagues at Fletcher and I to visit Moscow and MGIMO in person later this spring. So fingers crossed that that will work out. But my task today is to present some of my new research in the book that Max mentioned, "We Shall Be Masters," which some of you may recognize as a Dostoevsky quote. I had first thought of Dostoevsky as an author of profound novels, and only later realized that he was also an analyst of Russian foreign policy in Asia, and that gave me the idea for this title for the book. But the book actually emerged out of a couple of sets of questions. One was looking at the shift in Russian foreign policy over the past decade, but especially I think in the years after 2014 towards trying to play a bigger role in Asia, and I think in particular develop relations with China. And there's been, of course, much speculation and debate in the expert community as to whether this is a temporary relationship, a longstanding relationship, how to think about Russia's role in Asia going forward. But it seemed to me that there was a need for some historical understanding, because it's of course possible to sort of look at the present day and speculate about the future, but I think it's even more grounded if you can actually put it in the context of what does history show us, not because history will repeat itself in a sort of rigid way, but because history might illustrate some patterns that might be suggestive of future events. So that was one goal of this project. And a second goal or sort of set of questions was actually looking at the United States and its foreign policy over the past decade and a half, because we've seen many American leaders talk about plans to pivot their own foreign policies to this region or away from this region with some success, but also some failure. And so it seemed to me an interesting question more generally of how is it that countries decide at various points in time to focus on certain regions and at other points in time to focus on other regions. And of course, this is a question that I think extends far beyond Russia or the United States, and to a certain extent is relevant for many countries. So what I'll try to do in the next 20 minutes is throw up some slides and share with you some of the historical argument that I make following my study of Russian foreign policy from the days of Peter the Great, stretching back 300 years all the way up to the present, and then try to draw some very tentative and sketchy conclusions as to what this might mean for the future of Russian foreign policy in Asia and Russian relations with China. So let me share some slides to get started. First, I think it's obvious that the relationship between Russia and China today is at a historical peak. There's been ebbs and flows historically, but there's no doubt we're at the top, or at least near the top of a wave, although I don't think that necessarily means that we're headed down again anytime soon. It's hard to say. And certainly we've seen plenty of individual diplomacy between Russian leader, President Vladimir Putin, and Chinese President Xi Jinping, photographed here celebrating President Putin's birthday, I believe in 2018, if I recall correctly. And so it's not every day that leaders celebrate their birthdays together. So this seemed to me to be a substantive photo. Let me see if I can get my slides moving forward. There we go. And this is not, of course, for the first time in the history of Russia-China relations. If you look back historically, you can see previous instances of intense Russia-China collaboration, as well as more generally intense Russian foreign policy focus on East Asia. And this, of course, I think most commonly referenced today is the friendship between the Soviet Union and the PRC in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, which was a peak of cooperation. But in fact, as I came to realize over the course of my historical study, there have been a series of periods of intense Russian focus in East Asia, not only on China, but also on Japan and the areas around Korea and Manchuria before the contemporary borders of East Asia were drawn. So this does seem to me something that's to a certain extent cyclical in Russian foreign policy, not in a sort of rigid sense of following a set pattern, but rather something that has repeated itself multiple times before. So what I'd like to suggest to you in the first part of my talk today is that we can actually think about Russia's relations with Asian countries and its role in Asia through this historical lens. And here's the Dostoevsky's quote that I referenced at the outset, which I think shows some of the drivers, at least, of what does drive Russia to focus on Asia. But what's I think challenging is that if you look at the different case studies that I'll bring up historically, you find many different drivers in different places. So sometimes there are sort of traditional geopolitical drivers that would be understandable to a sort of realist theorist. Other times there are economic hopes in relations with Asia, which motivated, for example, the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad under Finance Minister and Foreign Minister Sergei Vita. Other times there are sort of ideological visions like Dostoevsky illustrates here, and they often coincide at the same time. So it's very difficult to ascertain what was the key driver in Russia's growing attention historically versus what was just a factor that was correlated but not necessarily causal. And I present no grand theory as to what drives Russia at certain times to turn to Asia. I think any such theory would be overly simplistic given the multiplicity of factors that were present. But it does strike me that there were a series of different factors, diplomatic and geopolitical, economic, and what I'll loosely call ideological, in attracting Russia's attention towards Asian countries. And again, this isn't necessarily super unique to Russia. You could sort of tell the same story with many European powers over the course of the past couple of hundred years, and to a certain extent to the United States as well. And so first, what I'll try to do is sketch out a bit of how I see Russia's imperial vision on the Pacific Ocean developing in the days of the Tsarist Empire, when imperialism was sort of the framework of Russian foreign policy, and then during the Soviet period, and then up to the present. And obviously there are many differences between these different periods, but I think there are some similarities as well, which I'll try to sketch out. And I'll start in a place that most people don't think of when they think of Russian foreign policy, and that's on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, where for a short period in the 1810s, there were 3 Russian forts established on the island of Kauai, and the king who ruled Kauai very briefly became a Russian subject for about a year before, which was the amount of time it took to send a note to St. Petersburg saying that they'd inducted a new subject in the Russian Empire. And then the foreign ministry wrote back to their agents in Kauai and said, actually, we'd rather not have Kauai, which might have been a mistake because Kauai is a wonderful place to visit. I had a chance to visit this fort on Kauai several years ago. It's the furthest south the Russian Empire stretched in the Pacific, and one of the forts itself still stands. And you might ask yourself, well, how is it that the Russian Empire ended up building a fort on the island of Kauai, so far from the territories we think of when we think of a Russian imperial foreign policy, and in this case, in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, which were some of the most challenging and costly wars that Russia faced in the 19th century. It's surprising in many ways that on the almost opposite side of the world of the great battles of the Napoleonic War, Russia was nevertheless building forts. But it turns out that in the early 1800s, in the years during and following the Napoleonic Wars, there was a series of efforts to establish an imperial sphere that stretched across the Pacific. Many of you are probably familiar with Russian settlement in Alaska, which peaked really in the early 1800s, around the same time as the Russian fort was built in Hawaii. And similarly in California, in Fort Ross, there was a small Russian settlement as well. And today these are often seen as sort of historical artifacts. But in fact, at the time, there was a grand imperial vision that tried to connect them. And at the time, the Pacific was disputed between multiple different great powers. The Spanish Empire was in a period of decline and collapse. The British were distracted by the Napoleonic Wars. The Americans at the time were still a small number of colonies, or now states on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, not the Pacific. So you could tell a story in the early 1800s of a chance for Russia to expand its empire across the Pacific. And indeed, we've got plenty of evidence from the archives of the Foreign Ministry and the Russian American Company of the time of great interest among policymakers in St. Petersburg of this type of imperial expansion across the Pacific. But it faced a number of really fundamental challenges as well that no amount of enthusiasm could overcome. One of those was the challenge of supply. It was just extraordinarily difficult to get supplies to a place as isolated at the time as Sitka. And again, this is before the construction of the Trans-Siberian railroads. If you wanted to get supplies from St. Petersburg or from Moscow to Alaska, you had to march them all the way across Siberia before putting them on a ship and sailing through the North Pacific waters. It was just a very difficult operation. And so as a result, the ambitions and the enthusiasm about empire weren't matched by logistical realities. And this was a challenge the Russian Empire in the Pacific consistently faced. It was impossible to supply food in a cost-effective manner. There was regular outbursts of scurvy in the Alaskan settlements because there was not the right diet of food. And there was no way around this in the absence of better logistics, and better logistics were simply impossible to build. So there was a mismatch that developed between the ambitions, between the sense of geopolitical openness, and between the realities of transportation and economics, which ultimately induced Russia to abandon its forts in Hawaii and California and sell its Alaskan settlements several decades later. And we have a map of the main Russian fort on Kauai was Fort Elizaveta. And you can kind of see, if you look at the North Pacific from this angle, how you could connect Fort Ross with the Alaskan islands, with Petropavlovsk and Kamchatka as one big maritime sphere. But it was a very difficult maritime sphere to control when your shipbuilding facilities were all in the Baltic Sea predominantly, or in the or to a lesser extent along the shores of the Arctic Ocean rather than in the Pacific. So there's this mismatch between logistics and ambitions, which ultimately doomed the effort to build an imperial sphere in the North Pacific. And so for several decades afterwards, the Russian Empire ignored, for the most part, the Pacific. It wasn't a period of focusing on the area. There were concerns in Europe. There were issues to deal with at home. And so for decades, the Pacific was basically forgotten until several decades later, under the leadership of a new governor general of East Siberia, Nikolai Muravyov, a new idea emerged of conquering the lands along the Amur River. And what struck me about this effort to populate and to gain formal control of the lands along the Amur River was the extent to which, again, extraordinary optimism and enthusiasm seems to have been a real driver of Russian foreign policy making. And although the policy was approved in St. Petersburg, in fact, the figure of Governor General Muravyov himself seems to have been absolutely crucial in attracting the attention of officials in St. Petersburg towards this territory. He wrote memos and and supported intellectuals who described the Amur as a potential Russian Mississippi, suggesting there'd be a vast commerce taking place along the river. And one of his advisors even described the Amur River as a holy land, which seemed to me as a striking way to describe a territory which at that point had very little established settlement at all, and such settlement that was there was mostly not Russian settlement. But there was this enthusiasm for taking the territory, trying to develop it, turning it into a new outlet for Russian energies and economic growth in the Pacific. And Russia successfully acquired this territory via a series of treaties, the latter of which was signed at gunpoint with the Qing Empire, which is at this point in this period of imperial collapse, and acquired the lands that are now a big chunk of the Russian Far East at this point during the late 1850s and 1860s. But what was striking about this effort to acquire the territories is the extent to which, after they were acquired, like with the Pacific Empire described previously, there was only a limited effort to develop them. As before, it was extraordinarily difficult to get from Moscow or even from Irkutsk to the Russian Far East. There were very few settlers who at this point wanted to come and settle the lands. And so from the day Russia acquired these territories, there was actually concern that since there were so few Russian settlers, the number of Chinese and Koreans who were planning to settle there might tip the ethnic balance of the territory and threaten Russia's control over them. And so for a long time in these territories, after they were acquired around 1860, the predominant forms of settlement were either military forces that were placed there, or prisoners who were sent to the Far East for exile. And it wasn't until decades afterwards, once the railroads began to be built, that these territories began to be settled. And indeed, Governor General Muravyov, after he succeeded in integrating these lands into the Russian Empire and doing so in a way that really established Russian superiority over Qing China, the Qing Empire that governed China at the time. He himself spent his retirement in Paris. He left the Far East after conquering the lands and never really turned back. He would follow the developments of the Far East from the newspapers that arrived to him in Paris, and he's actually still buried in Paris today. You can still see his grave there. And so there was several decades of sort of ignoring the territory, and the prediction that the territory would turn into sort of a holy land, as some of the intellectuals around Muravyov predicted, proved to be false. So here too, there's this mismatch between the infrastructure that is available to the Russian Empire at this time and the ambitions that were espoused. And so the ambitions end up being tempered by the infrastructure that's available. And I mean infrastructure not only in the sense of specific transportation infrastructure, like the lack of railroads, which was beginning to be an important issue at this time, but also more generally the governance capacity. If you look at the number of officials that the Russian Empire had in the Russian Far East, it was far fewer than in the rest of the Russian Empire. If you look at the Russian population at this time, it was, as you'd expect, as today, very heavily focused on the western part of Russia and the territories of Ukraine and Belarus, contemporary Ukraine and Belarus, that were part of the Russian Empire, rather than in the far eastern territories. So there was just not any sort of built-in focus on this region that attracted the attention of Russian policymakers after it was acquired. And so, like the Russian Empire across the Pacific that existed for about a decade and then was relinquished in Hawaii and in California and later on in Alaska, so too the efforts to build a focus on the territories of the Russian Far East, the Amur and Ussuri River, between the time when they were first acquired in the 1850s and 60s and all the way up through really the 1890s, they were basically ignored. It just wasn't seen as anything worth focusing on. So here too, this kind of enthusiasm and then loss of interest over time. Now, sometimes Russia's historic focuses on Asia ended not with a loss of interest, but rather with excessive interest that pulled Russia into a catastrophic situation. And the best example of this is in the run-up to the war with Japan in 1904 and 1905, in part directly to remedy the logistical challenges that I sketched out previously. Russian leaders in the latter decades of the 19th century began building some of the infrastructure that you need to populate the Far East, to establish a more direct sense of control over it, and also to build its economy. They built the Trans-Siberian Railroad, for example, and a variety of other types of infrastructure, port facilities, for example, in Vladivostok, other types of infrastructure precisely to build up Russian presence in the Far East. And at the time, if you read the predictions of people like Count Witte, what you'll find is language that looks strikingly similar to what people talk about today. Asia is the market of the future. Tapping into Japanese and Chinese markets is crucial to extending Russian trade. You can sort of read Count Witte as sort of like a prophet of globalization of sorts of the 19th century. And so in some ways it seems remarkably similar to the present. But of course, it ended very badly for Russia, not primarily because the trade disappointed, although I think to a certain extent you'd have to argue that it did disappoint, but rather because in this case, Russia's ambitions outstripped its military capabilities in the Far East. And at the time, Russia very rationally was mostly focused on its military capabilities on its European front. There had been several decades earlier a war with the Ottoman Empire. There was always the risk of some sort of clash with the European power, and the Far East was seen as a theater with second-tier military powers that didn't need to be focused on. And of course, there were people in the Russian general staff who were quite concerned about the military position in the Far East. One influential general at the time described Russia as a comet with a dense European core and a dangerously long tail stretching across Eurasia. And there was constant fear among the general staff that any sort of a war with China or Japan would be very difficult to win, simply because if the Trans-Siberian Railroad were cut, so too Russia's lines of communications would be cut as well. And it was a long railroad, so there were many places that it could potentially be cut. But the concerns of military officials weren't fully reflected in the assessments of decision makers in St. Petersburg, and above all in the person of Tsar Nicholas II, who I think for reasons primarily of racism rather than from analysis, just couldn't take seriously the prospect that the Japanese were a serious military force. And this was standard among European analyses at the time, even after Japan completely obliterated Chinese military forces in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, 1895. No one in Europe took Japan seriously, even after that fact. And so as a result, when Japan did decide to go to war with Russia with a surprise attack on Russian naval facilities in the Far East, Russia was not ready for war, not the fault of its military, but the fault of its political leadership, who simply hadn't placed anywhere near the amount of forces you need in the Far East to actually win the war. And of course, as many of you are probably familiar with, the war itself was waged in a way that was not very effective. The Russian fleet was both the Pacific and the Baltic fleet were sank. But even absent the sort of surprising military defeats of Russia, there was simply no doubt that Russia wasn't prepared for a war with Japan because it had underestimated the strength of Japanese military forces. And so here you see a different type of mismatch that caused a turn back away from Asia, a mismatch between the geopolitical ambitions and military forces on the ground. And I do find it striking if you look at the diplomacy between Russia and Japan over the division of Korea, which was at the time the Japanese proposed dividing it into a north and a southern half of Korea, sort of like Korea is divided today. You can sort of see very interesting echoes of the Korean War emerge a half century earlier on, and Tsar Nicholas and several of his friends and advisors at the court had great ambitions for Korea, but I never had anywhere near the military power you'd need to stand up to the Japanese in a territory that was ultimately far closer to Japan's population centers than it was to Moscow or to St. Petersburg. And so this is a different type of logistical challenge, as I mentioned, a challenge of military logistics rather than a challenge of economic logistics. Now, after the Tsarist Empire was overthrown by the Bolsheviks, they too, interestingly, quickly focused on Asia as an outlet, both for their geopolitical visions, but also for their revolutionary fervor. And although for the first couple of years of Bolshevik power, the focus was on sparking revolution in Europe and Germany above all, soon afterwards, the Bolsheviks turned to China as a place where they thought they could win supporters to their cause and also push back against foreign imperialists, above all the British Empire, which was at the time seen as their primary rival. And there were a number of Bolshevik leaders over the course of the 1920s who described the Soviet Union as sort of a mecca for the East, which is a really interesting turn of phrase for the Bolsheviks to have used. But they deployed very successfully, I think you'd have to argue, at least in the early 1920s, a number of organizers and military advisors to China to organize a revolutionary party. And my favorite example is this gentleman here, Mikhail Borodin, who actually spent a big chunk of his life not far from my hometown of Chicago. He was a revolutionary who was left Russia after 1905 and moved to Chicago. I was a school teacher there briefly, got married, had kids, lived the bourgeois life for about a decade. And then when the revolution broke out in 1917, seized by revolutionary fervor, he returned to St. Petersburg and then was sent to China, where although he didn't know any Chinese, he was thought to be the best person for the job and was actually very successful at helping to set up the Kuomintang Party, which is of course the party that ruled China in the 1920s and 30s and now is in a kind of strange quirk of history, one of the two biggest political parties in Taiwan. So you can draw a straight line from St. Petersburg to Chicago to Taiwan today, if you trace the Kuomintang history. But what's striking to me about the example of Borodin is how, for a time, the relationship between the Soviet Union and nationalist China was one of the most important, probably the most important relationship the Soviet Union had in Asia, and the Soviets played a major role in helping establish the Kuomintang's military training facilities. It helped plan their budgets. It helped write the constitution of the party, which was interestingly written in English because that was the language that Borodin and Sun Yat-sen shared, was English. So they wrote the Kuomintang constitution in English, kind of bizarrely. And for a time, this actually appeared to be working. The Kuomintang was an anti-imperialist party, pushed back against the British. But here too, there was a type of overstretch or a mismatch between the reality of what the Bolsheviks could offer and the demands that the Kuomintang in China actually wanted. The Kuomintang were ultimately looking not for a patron, but just for tactical help. They wanted arms, they wanted funds, they wanted diplomatic support against the British, but they weren't interested in becoming a sort of second-tier player to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and they weren't actually really interested in communism at all. Although Sun Yat-sen regularly made vague statements about being a revolutionary, in fact, neither he nor Chiang Kai-shek were committed to communism, although Chiang Kai-shek's son, for a time, did seem to be a committed communist. But the Bolsheviks spent a lot of political capital and a lot of ideological capital supporting the Kuomintang over the course of the 1920s. At one point in Red Square, there was a mass rally in the mid-1920s that held up pictures of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Chiang Kai-shek, somewhat shockingly, as if he was one of the great revolutionary leaders of the world. But it all ended quite badly for the Bolsheviks' efforts in East Asia, in part because once Chiang Kai-shek established his control over much of China, he ousted the communists internally and downgraded his relations with the Soviet Union. So here too, I think there's an example of a sort of enthusiasm of revolutionary fervor in the case of the Bolsheviks, and optimism about what it's possible to accomplish, but then ultimately a sense of disappointment about what really matters, and to turn back towards relations with Europe, which dominated Soviet foreign policy over the course of the 1930s. And from the perspective of the darkening clouds in Europe over the 1930s, it was sort of inevitable that this would happen given the risk of war. China came to be seen as something of a sideshow. And then finally, I won't dwell too much on the most recent sort of period of optimism about diplomacy in Asia. There was, of course, great optimism in the Soviet Union when the communists finally did take power in China in 1949. And as many of you are probably familiar, that only lasted for a half decade or maybe a decade before the falling out between Khrushchev and Mao Zedong. So as the history suggests, there's a period of fluctuations in the extent to which Russian leaders have focused on East Asia. What I think these case studies suggest, and what I try to lay out in the book, is the extent to which enthusiasm has been a driver of Russian pivots to Asia in the past. Enthusiasm about new markets, enthusiasm about imperial visions, enthusiasm about revolutionary alignments that aren't often correlated with the realities on the ground. And indeed, what's always striking to me in all of these cases, I think, is the extent to which any sort of objective assessment of Russia's interests, if you were a person who believed that nations acted with their interests primarily in mind, would say Russia's interests are focused on the European front. That's where the Russian populace is. That's where the Russian economic interconnections are. That's where the greatest security threats by far to Russia came from. Hardly any security threats to Russia came from the Far East, simply because of the logistical challenges compared to what Russia faced in the 19th and 20th century from the plains of Eastern Europe. And yet, nevertheless, despite this enduring set of interests focused on Europe, nevertheless, on a regular basis, this enthusiasm about potential gains in Asia overtook Russian leaders. And so it seems to me that this might also be a useful analogy in understanding Russia's relations with Asia today. And perhaps, as Max alluded to at the outset of our discussion, we're seeing a bit of this right now, that although, yes, certainly there's enthusiasm, especially from, I think, the leaders themselves of Russia and China personally over the relationship. In fact, Russia's interests, positive interests and negative interests, the opportunities it has and the challenges it faces are largely focused in Europe. And so I think what we should draw from this is a bit of skepticism about claims that there will be great future importance on Asia for Russia. Certainly the entire world is focusing more on Asia now than it did several decades ago, although that was true in Witt's time as it is in our time. But it does seem to me that the enduring features of Russian political economy, of Russian security challenge, of the Russian state, and where the Russian populace lives suggests that whatever political leaders are saying about the importance they place on Asia, whether relations with Asia are good or bad, whether there's seem to be opportunities or challenges, it seems to me that we should treat them with some skepticism because of the enduring importance of Russia's interests on the European front. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to Anna's reactions and would love any questions or comments that you all have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. It was very enlightening. I learned a lot from your presentation and from your book, honestly. I haven't really given this issue that much thought. So thanks for creating actually the appetite for a further study of the subject matter. Let me just turn quickly to Anna and her comments and views on the issue, and then I'll perhaps ask one question in relation to your presentation and to today's situation. Anna?
So much for having me and for the opportunity to read this book and to talk on the book, because the book is really fascinating. At first I thought, oh my God, it's going to be a historical reading. Probably this is going to be boring. You know, I'm more of a political scientist than a historian, so it's just some kind of bias that is inherent in my perspective. However, it turned out that it's really extremely fascinating reading. Sometimes it really seemed that I was reading some kind of fascinating novel rather than a historical book. That's not what you actually expect. And this is one of the main reasons I really do recommend to have a look on this book and to read the book. And the several days I have spent with the book, I think they have been one of the most interesting lately for me. So I think what are really very strong points of this book. At first, this is a true macro historical approach. So this is kind of a longer approach. We look at very important critical junctures, important periods, and we see the pattern of the evolution. This is very interesting because the author brings us throughout very different eras and focuses within the region and within Russia's policy in Asia. Also, there is a lot of background. And I mean, why the reading the book is really fascinating, because you don't just look on Russia's policy in Asia towards specific areas or towards specific issue areas or states, whatever, but you also look into the thinking of Russian leaders, of prominent figures such as officials, governors, traders, even adventurers, and even writers. I mean, a very different set of people we have here, and it's really very rich in quotations. So it seems that you really get some understanding of the era, of how the leadership was thinking, of how different actors were thinking, and this is really very well, I think a rare thing in such a historical book that brings you through different centuries, and this what made the reading really fascinating. So a lot of quotes, and I think the immersion effect is really very strong. The analysis is very meticulous in everything that Chris has a look at. It's really very in depth, and this is very interesting. I think one of the major conclusions is that, well, when we usually look at, I don't know, just from the political science perspective, we try to figure out what are the national interests, what are the capabilities, this kind of way. But from this book, you get a very good understanding that national interests are perceived and are also subjective, and they are represented by different figures within the foreign policy elite, within the economic elite, and you can see different actors domestically as well. And I guess this is a very important perspective that this book brings into the studies of Russia's foreign policy and Russia's policy in Asia specifically. And as Chris has pointed out, actually, sometimes it seems that perception of the region did matter more than the real situation. So actually the devil here is a lot in the details of perception. And also the book has a lot of stunning facts and some really brand new interpretations. The first thing that caught me was this Dostoevsky quote, and especially the thing that in Asia we are Europeans. I guess this is why a lot of people from Asia now, before the pandemics, came to Vladivostok in the forest, because they perceived it as the closest part of Europe they can actually access. And I guess it's very true to for this day as well. And also what I personally found fascinating, Peter the Great is probably not the first leader whom you think about when you contemplate on Russia's pivot to Asia, but it's really, the book provides this understanding and does it very nicely. And also I should say that it's enormous number of footnotes, lots of literature documents, archive materials. So it's really a very in-depth study here that we have. Chris has actually already outlined the main idea, and it's really interesting that Russia has demonstrated cycles of interest and disinterest in Asia. And when we look at all these different cases through different centuries, we can clearly see that there used to be some interest. Sometimes it was really grounded in reality, sometimes not really grounded in reality, but more kind of El Dorado perception thing. Sometimes it was rather opportunistic, I would say. So the Russian leadership looked for some opportunities and tried to capture them. Sometimes it was successful, I think more often than not, but in some cases it wasn't really successful here. Also, what is interesting is that Chris puts a lot of emphasis on internal factors, like again, diplomacy, new lands, trade, and we can see in many cases that again, the real capabilities are anchored in the West. So in many cases, we do have a pattern of pullback. And what I really liked was the idea that interest fluctuates, but limitations are enduring, and the limitations are mostly physical in nature: infrastructure, lack of population, and also lack of economic engagement. And the last chapter, the concluding chapter, it shows us President Putin's address to the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok in 2015, and you really do have the deja vu effect. Oh my God, is it happening really again? So it's kind of a vision of a lot of opportunities, but you really start thinking like, okay, but we still do have a lot of limitations, especially again in the economic sphere, in the economic domain, and in different kind of economic links here. So I would say that probably it means that the interest actually is definite. The interest, Russia's interest in Asia is here, but probably the level of its interest, the level and what number of resources Russia has really been keen to put into this interest, it has really been very, very unsteady. And I think the book demonstrates it very convincingly, and this is what makes it really interesting. So I've got a number of questions and kind of critical comments as well for you. I mean, what do you think is still the major pattern behind this? Why has the interest shifted? I mean, Asia is probably secondary to Europe, right, and to the neighborhood. I mean, if we compare it in terms of priorities. But in some points of time, you have demonstrated that the interest has been here. But then I would say why Russia has been really unwilling to devote substantial resources and capabilities in the long term, or even sometimes in the middle term. So this would be my major question for you, because I guess this is the question that has not really been answered in the book, and you point out, I think, very truly about the current nature of Russia's pivot to Asia, that economically it is still too weak, as it has often been historically. So I would like to ask, what do you think are the major reasons, the major driving factors behind this? I mean, kind of structural factors, not probably some specific personal factors here. Also, it is also connected with the discourse on Russia as a Eurasian power. As you mentioned in your book, Russia went to acquire new lands, and with the new lands came some interactions with Asian powers. So what does it mean in terms of Russia positioning itself? Does it make Russia also a kind of Asia-Pacific power or Pacific power, or this kind of Eurasian rather than European power? So what is your take on this discourse? One thing that probably would be more like a point of criticism or a different approach if you look at it. As there is a lot of focus on specific personalities and a lot of details here, and it's really, again, fascinating, but sometimes it seems that kind of structural approach has been lacking at some point of the work. So you actually start wondering, what are the national interests? I mean, of course, they have changed, evolved throughout centuries. I mean, that's quite logical, but probably there should be still some common ground on what the interests are on this or that point of time. Again, what factors have prevented Russia to become more seriously engaged in Asia? What about social links? Have they really been as developed as if we compare it with Europe? What about Russia's so-called deep state or bureaucratic state? Is it also one of the factors here? And one of the things that actually I have been wondering about, also you mentioned Vita, and the chapter on Vita was very interesting. So what about commercial interests and economic interests? I mean, what have been these interests being in practice, real, tangible interests, not as perceived by high-profile officials, but I mean real interest. Another way to look at it is also kind of center-periphery relations within the state. And here, I guess the Far East just fits very neatly to the picture of center-periphery relations, very typical of many states, not only Russia. Probably the case of the Far East is just kind of very unique because the distance is unprecedented, I mean, for any other country. So it's something I think that also could be explored if we look at this topic. Also, it's really great that in the very beginning you mentioned that this is the tradition of studying the East in Russia, and the East is actually a very, I mean, it's a complex phenomenon. It's not only East Asia, it's also South Asia, it's also the Middle East, but it's also Africa, all which is not actually the West. So I guess the book still is more focused on Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, with a small exception of Vietnam, I guess, during the Soviet period, is mostly missing from the analysis here. So, however, I would say that bringing it more into the picture in your future research would also help. India actually features during the Cold War, although India is not East Asia, and there is also something in Afghanistan, which is definitely not East Asia at all. But again, it would be interesting if you could say a couple of words about Southeast Asia as well here. Also, Russia seems to be very different from European colonial powers in Asia. In many ways, probably the Far East and also maybe Alaska was a kind of frontier for Russia. It's not actually, well, in many ways similar to the United States. Also, it hasn't been a classical colonial power like European powers were, but here I guess it could also bring some perspective. And Russia has also enjoyed very rich academic tradition studying of Asia and its own Asian scholarship, which probably accounts for this fact as well. Of course, if you look at several centuries of Russia's policy in Asia, I mean, it's quite logical that you cannot cover everything. I mean, no book can cover everything. But there were really some pieces that I felt as if they were missing from this overall picture that you have it very brilliantly. Just to provide a few striking things. You mentioned Vladivostok in the middle 19th century, but I guess that Vladivostok in the late 19th century and early 20th century was a very different place. And there was a lot of economic activity going on with Russian-American company. There were links with San Francisco. There were very interesting memoirs by Eleanor Prey in Vladivostok. And there's a great history here which is not really covered. So I'm wondering why you didn't look at it from this perspective. I mean, just some people who, some period of time when there was kind of vigorous development of the area historically. Also for me, it's not because I'm a Japan specialist, but well, kind of maybe. Interaction with Japan is in many ways missing, except for the war in the early 20th century, including all this thing about the San Francisco Peace Treaty and post-Second World War, also 1990s. So I guess that Japan is probably the second major important power after China, if we look at Northeast Asia. So it was a little bit of surprising. On the Soviet time, I guess all this Asia thing also falls a lot into the pattern of interaction with the third world in general. And I guess that this picture was a little bit lacking. But what I really had some kind of trouble with was the last chapter. Probably because you try to cover a lot of really very different historical periods, very different periods. But it seems kind of a little bit sketchy, not really detailed. Just if we compare it to the brilliant detailed analysis that we find in the book earlier. And there are several assumptions on Putin and the current pivot to Asia that it's really, they're just asking you to challenge them. Probably I would just say a couple of major things. I guess that Russia's isolation from Europe currently is probably an overstatement. Maybe it's not seen as it is from the United States, but we in Moscow certainly perceive that as kind of overstatement. Also, it's very difficult to be concerned with the argument that before 2014, Asia played a minor role for Russia's foreign policy. And I guess what is really missing is the look on kind of Russia's pivot to Asia, Russia's Asian policy since early 21st century, since maybe even late 1990s, when Primakov launched the idea of Russia, India, China strategic triangle, and also since the early Putin's time, since early 21st century, we have seen that Asia has risen in prominence in terms of foreign policy, economics, energy, which you do mention, energy, but all the other things really are not, well, mentioned here in the book and the analysis. So I guess that what we are seeing at now is not actually some new thing that started 2014, but rather it got a very kind of push or new impetus in 2014. But this idea that Russia should have a multi-vector policy, should have balanced relationships, should diversify, should hedge, should do hedging, put its eggs not only in the Euro basket and the West basket, but also in other baskets as well, including China, India, and even Japan and South Korea economically. I guess it has been here all this way for more than two decades already. So I would say it's not definitely something that started only 2014 here. So I think that's a major takeaways that I do have. And what's really interesting that the conclusion, it has the other way around. So it brings us back from Putin to actually Russia's colonization of the Pacific. So you kind of go backwards, and this way again you do have this question: if Russia is going to emerge again as a kind of Asia-Pacific power, or maybe a kind of Pacific power, or is going to concentrate more on the Eurasian kind of continental landmass identity, landmass discourse. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wow, that I think would thank you so much for your time and the very meticulous analysis of this book. And if we could perhaps, would be perhaps too much to ask, of course, but if you could pack your answers in about 7 to 5 minutes so that we can have some Q&A and discussion with our listeners, that would be great. Just a reminder to our participants here that you can send your questions to our chat box, as our colleague Maria Nivolsina already did, or you can ask your questions once Chris answers Anna's. Thank you.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Anna, for all of those comments. I think we could probably spend many days, and I hope we have the chance at some point to spend many days discussing all of them. Let me just try to pick up on a couple of the things you said and try to address some of them that way. I think the first question is on thinking about Russia's interests, and as you said, Anna, I'm thinking about the national interest over time. There's a debate obviously among international relations theorists and political scientists as to how interests are formed. Are they sort of there for us to discover, or are they created in our own minds? And I guess the answer is, certainly a mix of both. And as a historian, I can sort of say things like that are not acceptable to political scientists, to have sort of a multifaceted answer. But I think they are both. I mean, it's naturally the case that any country has interests in other regions that have borders. Now, what scale of interests, what level of interest is to be debated, but in that basic sense alone, it's sort of natural that Russia has some interest in what happens in East Asia, simply because Russia has a long land and sea border in East Asia. And I think certain interests are sort of inevitable and natural as well. You naturally want expanding prosperity and commerce. In the abstract, it's hard to disagree with things like that. You naturally want security, hard to disagree with things like that. But what struck me throughout the history was the extent to which, although these interests are sort of always present to a certain extent, as you alluded to, they're refracted through worldviews and prioritizations that change quite drastically. And I think what's really interesting to me is that you certainly have shifts in worldview between different generations of leaders. That's true in Russia. I think that's true in many countries. So if you compare, Alexander I to actually the several czars that come after him, there's a sense of Russia being a great power in the world, on the European stage, versus a focus on defending and securing Russia from threats at home and abroad. Certainly when you transition again to Nicholas II in the latter decades of the 19th century, there's again an emergence of a more sort of expeditionary sense of Russian power that hadn't been there in as great a way previously. So these interests are sort of refracted through the worldviews of different generations of leadership. And I guess in an empire like the Tsarist Empire, there were sort of individual czars that played a very big role because they were so powerful in the system. But even then, there were individual thinkers and foreign ministers and things like that who shaped the worldview of leaders. And so, although the interests, to a certain extent, you could say remained the same, peace, prosperity along Russia's borders, the way you achieve those in the views of leaders changed drastically. And they changed in ways that I think are hard to explain primarily by what you might call objective factors of the geopolitical situation. They changed in part because of the perceptions and the prioritizations of different generations of leaders. And I think the prioritization question ended up, to me, being really crucial. Because in a country that's as big as Russia and borders as many regions, you can choose what region you prioritize to a certain extent. And even when you face security threats on your border, you can choose whether you cut deals that make those threats go away, or do you address them head on. And I guess I was struck by the extent to which the prioritization of challenges, both opportunities and challenges, seemed to me not obviously explainable by what I'd call objective factors, and to stem more from just how the leadership of the time saw the world. And so that, I think, led me to, I guess, what a political scientist would call a bit more of a constructivist interpretation of how these interests were kind of formed. In that it just did seem to me that when I looked at the map of the world at the time, whether it was facing Alexander I or Nicholas II or whoever, that it seemed to explain less to me than the worldviews that these policymakers had formed inside of them, which in turn shaped their prioritization. So I guess I come away thinking in the broad scope of history that matters a lot. And I think if you take a specific chunk where you know what a given leadership thinks its interests are, a specific chunk of time, you can you can think about interests being more enduring over years or even a decade or two, but when you zoom out over a century, I just find myself struggling to articulate what interests were in a way that wasn't like patently obvious, like peace and prosperity. So yeah, I guess I ended up being more of a constructivist on the question of interests, although I didn't really start that in any sort of theoretical sense. That's just sort of where the historical evidence pushed me. Maybe one final comment, to not take up too much time on your final point about how do you date Russia's current increase in interest in Asia. I think I agree completely that, dating back to Primakov, certainly, and both Primakov as prime minister, but also Primakov as advisor to the kind of the latter 2 decades of Soviet leaders as well. Certainly there's a sense of a Russia, China, India, and there's also sort of in the Gorbachev era, there was a dream of a Soviet, China, India kind of triangle emerging as well. I think what stands out to me is, again, the prioritization, I would say, changed over the past decade. And although this was always part of Russian foreign policy, the sense in which it was perceived to policymakers to make sense to devote a lot more resources and attention and time to Asia does seem to have increased more recently than over the past several decades. So that's, I think, how I would describe the shift we've seen over the past 10 years or so is not sort of something being created from nothing, but rather a long-running trend ticked upwards in a meaningful way, which I think is what we've seen over the past decade. So those are just 2 comments in response to a kind of a fascinating set of questions. I'd love to pick up on them more, but perhaps, Max, I'll turn it back to you to answer some other people's questions or comments as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both to Anna and Chris, for this exchange. And I think it's important that both the comments that Anna raised and the questions that Chris provided. We have one question in the chat that thanks, Chris, for the presentation. Asks where to get the book, obviously, and also the question is, can we apply the same approach, quote-unquote, enthusiastic ups and downs in diplomacy and relations between Russia and China to other cases, say the policy of the Russian Empire and the later Soviet Union in the Caucasus? Yeah, and I also appreciate the term. I thought it was cool, the spasms of excitement of Asia. I think that works very well. Chris?
Yeah, that's a great question. In some ways, I wish it were put to you, Max, since you're probably more qualified expert in this question than I am. On the Caucasus,
you found the pattern. You're the guy. It's your nugget.
I don't know. I mean, I think that there's, in any region, any country, will have fluctuations. I guess what struck me about Russia's relations with East Asia is the extent to which, because most of Russia's core interests, as I call them, population, economy, military presence, security interests, were in Europe, it was much easier to tolerate fluctuations up and down in East Asia, simply because it was ultimately less important. You could fluctuate up and down without having nearly as much be at stake. Whereas my initial hunch would be that the closer you get to the geography that has historically been fundamental to the Russian state, parts of Siberia were really only integrated and the Far East really only integrated into the Russian state in a meaningful way in the past century and a half, in terms of having officials there present on a regular basis and collecting taxes and things like that. Whereas, if you look at European Russia, that's been part of the Russian state for many centuries. So if you look at the areas core to the Russian state from a historical perspective, I would hypothesize, without having done deep research on this, that fluctuations are higher stakes, because you don't want to fluctuate downwards, because this is more important intrinsically to the Russian state than East Asia is. And so I would put the Caucasus as sort of a higher level importance in general, which would, I think, suggest you'd have less fluctuation, but I say that very tentatively, since I haven't really done the research to justify that statement.
I perhaps have a similar question, and that could perhaps well, move it in a similar direction. But before, I think our colleague Leonid Petuchin was first. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation and ask your question, sir.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Professor Miller. It was very interesting. You've made my way from home very exciting. And thank you, Professor Kireyeva, for your great comment. It was also amazing. And thank you, Professor Suchkov, for your moderation. Also perfect.
Thank you.
I'm currently a graduate student in MGIMO, and I work as an advisor to the first deputy speaker of our State Duma. So it was very interesting and very beneficial, I think, for my work. I first heard about your book, I think, on China podcast around a year ago, and it was very nice to listen to it. And now I think it's a sign from God that I have to read it. So thank you so much. I think my question is kind of twofold. You spoke about our Russian pivots to Asia mostly as being practical in terms of, okay, it's way too far, we're going back, or I don't know, somewhat delusional. I mean, we can conquer everything. But I cannot help but wonder, you know, during the times of Peter the Great, we had our greatest pivot to Europe, I would say, and we adapted many things culturally, politically, economically. Have we, Russia is a great, well, no, at some point empire now is a great power. Have we adapted anything culturally or economically or politically from the East during all of our many pivots? If anything. And another question, if I may, to Professor Kireyeva, since Professor Suchkov described you as a great specialist on Asia, on the East, what do you think can we adapt now as a great power right now from the East? What can we learn from the East right now, what we haven't learned in the past, 8 years of the latest pivot? Thank you so much.
Lenny, thank you, Anya. Please don't fail me, because I introduced you the way, and now people think you have to meet the high standard. Chris?
Well, thank you, Leonid, for the question. What has Russia adopted from Asia? I mean, I think there's many things you could point to in sort of popular culture that were drawn from for interaction with Asia. There's obviously this history of economic exchange with Asia for a long time. Russia was the conduit of the tea trade from China through Russia to consumers in Russia and then onwards to Europe. So there's many things like that you could point to, but I take it that you're asking sort of more in terms of how Russia acts as a power on the world stage, if I'm interpreting your question right.
Yeah, because it really tickled me a little when you said that Nicholas, the second was quite racist. And when you're racist, you cannot adapt anything actually, because you treat everybody as inferior. Have we not actually adapted something, even though the treatment was?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I wonder whether it's true that you can't adopt things even if you're racist. I think there are probably some instances of a sense of superiority coupled with adoption. I mean, I guess implicit in your question is an assumption that there's sort of there are things that are Asian that one can adopt that are different from things that are European. And in a sense, I guess that's got to be true, but I wonder to what extent that is true. And I guess over the course of the last 2 centuries, it seems like we've had a convergence in diplomatic practice in terms of how countries in the world stage engage with each other. You have diplomats are trained via schools that look surprisingly similar. We read the same articles in many ways with some differences, but there's a lot more similarity, I think, today than there was 200 years ago. And over the past 2 centuries, there's been kind of a steady convergence in diplomatic practices, I guess, illustrated by the fact that Chiang Kai-shek's son was studying in Moscow gives you an example of convergence in practice. So I'm actually not sure, Linda, that there is a sort of an Asian model of diplomacy that one can learn from, in part because over the past 2 centuries, we've all, I think, across the world been converging on comparable diplomatic traditions. Not that we're all going to end up doing the same thing, but that I think the differences in diplomatic practice today are much less than you'd find in the past. And I'm not sure there's sort of an Asian tradition that I could really put my finger on today that would describe similarities between, Korean diplomacy, Japanese diplomacy, and Chinese diplomacy that would be, distinct from Denmark or Uruguay. So that's not a great answer probably to your question, but I guess it's I'm not sure there is a sort of Asian model
for you to write a second volume or added this one in your Anna.
That's a very tricky question because there is actually no single East. I mean, even you can't speak about East Asia as a single entity anymore, probably. So, and maybe never. That's why it's really a tricky question. Probably my answer would go to more to the field of political economy, I guess, because in terms of political economy, there are things that we could have a look at. Of course, we should have a look at more developed countries in Asia, in East Asia specifically, and how they manage their economy, how they manage to have a competitive environment, and how they manage to help their domestic national companies and corporations to become competitive globally. I guess this is something we can learn, because our political economy is also different from the liberal West. That's why it is something we could probably have more a look at in Asia specifically. And the other thing is also how to create kind of really special economic zones that can attract investment in specific areas where Russia can be competitive still in the Far East. But again, it drives us more into the question of the political economy, I guess, and it's not really the topic of this book. But if I may just ask one thing, one really very big question that I posed to Chris. I really am so keen to hear his answer. Just very briefly, why do you think Russia has not really committed long-term resources into developing the Far East and into its Asian policy? So, I mean, why hasn't it not stayed focused? So I guess it's something that I would really love to hear some answer.
Can we actually merge this question with the question we've received in the chat box that asks Chris on what Russia needs to do to realize its pivot to Asia? And it says its traditional means of extending its influence, military strength, natural resources, nuclear deterrence, have not been enough to make it a key regional power.
Great. Well, to answer Anna's question first, I think I'm struck by the extent to which, at least at certain times historically, Russia has devoted really substantial resources to East Asia. I think you can, if you look, for example, in the days of Vita, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was enormously expensive. Given the budgetary situation of the day, it was a huge infrastructure project that, if you kind of dig into the budget of the Tsarist government, was a major line item on that budget every single year it was being constructed. And so I think it's hard to go back and say to someone like Vita, you should have spent more, or you should have tried harder, given the sort of effort it took in terms of domestic politics to rearrange resources to make something like that possible. And I think you could say the same about the Soviet development effort in the Soviet Far East, I guess, from the 1930s until over the subsequent couple of decades. If you look at the transfer of population to the Far East, the subsidization of living standards in the Far East, the establishment of defense industrial facilities and massive mines and things like that, a lot of this was driven by sort of a plan to develop the Far East, and was also enormously expensive, and viewed through the lens of simple market economics was probably not a cost-efficient decision. It was a decision made on strategic rationales that the territory needed to be populated and developed in order to be secured. So there too, I think I wouldn't say, I look at this and say the answer would have been to devote even more resources, given the scale of resources that I think was devoted, and you know, you can probably argue were resources devoted in the right way, and were there problems along the way? You know, I'm sure the answer was to a certain extent, yes. But I guess I struggle to sort of envision a counterfactual, given resource constraints that were present at the time, that would have seen more resources being devoted in these two periods, relative to what actually was. So I kind of end up thinking that this at least is sort of structural in nature. If you've got a populace in the western part of your country, you've got this, you know, long tail of the comet, so to speak, which is just geographically hard and expensive to build infrastructure over. It's just very tricky to do given resource constraints. And the problem wasn't that there wasn't an effort. The problem was just that the numbers were hard to make add up. You know, as to the question in the chat box, you know, I think if Russia wants to make itself more of an Asian power, it obviously depends a lot on what type of power one wants to be. And I think we see in East Asia today countries that exercise power in very, very different ways. You know, I would say that North Korea and Japan are both meaningful powers in East Asia, but there's, you know, virtually no similarity in terms of how they actually exercise power. And I think that's a question that I guess Russia is, I think, still debating, or Russian leaders are still debating, as to when they think about making Russia an influential country in Asia, by what definition and using what sets of tools. You know, that how you answer that question will determine what you invest in, what you focus on. Is power about playing a bigger role in Asia economically? Is it about making sure Russia retains a substantial military force in Asia? Is it about having good relations with other countries? Is it about being able to pressure other countries to do what you want? I think how you answer that question about what type of power you want to exercise will tell you what sorts of resources you need to devote to answer that power. And I find it hard to talk about power sort of in the abstract of more versus less, unless you're going to ask, well, what is this power going to try to accomplish for you?
All right, thank you so much. Our colleague Igor Istomin, I know, wanted to pop. Yes.
Hello again. Yes, Chris obviously knows me for quite some time, but just for the record, Igor Istomin, associate professor here at MGIMO, and also research fellow at the Center for Advanced American Studies at MGIMO. You know, Chris, you are, as a historian, you make this very sophisticated and advanced argument with a lot of moving parts. And then I come with as a simple political scientist by training, and get just kind of one idea which I get out of this argument is that this is, to much extent, the story that you tell is a story of overextension. That, you know, the power which kind of tries to go forward and goes beyond. And I really like the map that you showed in the beginning from the early 19th century, where basically the whole Northern Pacific Ocean is a Russian lake, so to speak, where it has everything. And then it is not sustainable. It is overextension. It has to go back. And I think this is the story that repeats itself, right? Also in the Soviet times, when they tried to go and they tried to kind of support the communist China. You could also see it as another example of an overextension, and so on and so forth. So my question would be kind of then, based on the inference of your book, but having to do with today. Do you think, or do you see any signs that Russia today reaches an overextension in Asia? Because in my sense, its commitments in Asia today seem rather limited. There are obviously certain interests in terms of trade, in terms of investments, but if we talk about, you know, commitments, I do not see that many commitments on the Russian side. There are no major military deployments in this region. We know that the military stuff is brought in the other part of the country primarily, especially now. Or there are no kind of additional territorial claims, no financial burdens in this area for Russia. It's more in the post-Soviet space, for example. And even in terms of leadership time, you could see that Russian president basically doesn't waste that much time in all this useless multilateral East Asian forums. So are there any signs of overextensions, and what are they? What do you think?
Yes, thank you, Igor. Can I go ahead, Max? That's a great question. And I figured Igor would save the hardest question for last. No, I think you're right that this is partially a story of overextension, but I think the challenge with overextension narratives is that there's a question of resources available and willingness to spend. And sometimes countries are willing to spend a whole lot for things that in hindsight look confusing. And other times they're willing to spend very little for things that you might otherwise suspect to be willing to spend on. And so I struggle with sort of a simple overextension narrative because it seems to me to miss the fluctuation in willingness to spend, which I think is really quite important in any sort of story of imperial expansion and contraction. Empire use here is great power, empire, you can use whatever word you want. And I think if you look not only at Russia, but in many other big countries that do expand and contract over time, you find ideological shifts or shifts in worldview as important in determining contraction and expansion as you do as sort of objective factors. So that to me seems really important. I guess the example of this, I think, is I look at the unfortunate history of Afghanistan over the past 200 years. And I think you could try to tell the story of the various countries that have tried and failed to subjugate Afghanistan as a story of simple exhaustion of resources. But I think whether you're looking at the British in the 1840s or the Soviet Union in the 1980s or the United States for the past 20 years, it seems to me it's equally important to look at how are the elites, how are the foreign policy class thinking about their prioritization of the problem, and so that's where I push back against about overextension narratives that sort of assume a static willingness to pay relative to interest. I think that does kind of change. So that's kind of the historical question. On the present day, I think you're absolutely right to say that Russian commitments today are substantially lower than they've been at any point over the past couple of decades. I think maybe you could point to the sort of Gorbachev era diplomatic offensive in Asia in the 1980s. As sort of comparable to today. There was great optimism on the part of Gorbachev personally in his relations with not only Deng Xiaoping in China, but also Rajiv Gandhi in India about creating, again, kind of this early iteration of what we discussed with Primakov earlier, the sort of Russia, China, India triangle. Optimism that wasn't based on guarantees or commitments, but what was optimism nevertheless that then disappointed. But I think that's sort of a separate than than what you raised, and I would agree that there's no sort of signs of overextension in Russian diplomacy in Asia today, partly because no commitments have really been made. It's a different question whether there's a mismatch between optimism and reality, which I'm actually not completely sure whether there's a mismatch today or whether optimism has been deflated to a certain extent over the past couple of years. It's a match reality more closely. I guess I looked at over the past couple of years, the rise and focus on the Greater Eurasian Partnership concept as sort of a shift in the approach to Asia that was less China-centric. But no, I think broadly speaking, you're absolutely right to note, this is a huge difference between today and say the period of Count Witte, for example.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes remaining, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention one thing to Chris. When we announced that you'd be talking, many people here angrily messaged me to interrogate you on your latest articles in Foreign Affairs and Politico, where you call to sanction Russia if there is invasion to Ukraine. And I obviously I wasn't going to do it, But I think what is important in the sense and what you suggested in those articles in our conversation today, a short answer and perhaps a short question and perhaps a short answer. If everything bad that we hope is not going to happen, but we anticipate may as well happen, you know, the war and the sanctions and stuff evolve, would Russia's further pivot to Asia, would you say, be considered a pivot of necessity or a pivot of choice? Because this is somewhat, you know, on people's minds here.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I guess first to say that I sincerely hope that that the scenario Max sketched out doesn't happen. So let me say that at the outset. I mean, I think if the U.S. were to decide to impose the types of sanctions that I discussed in that article, you know, it would be the largest program of financial sanctions imposed on a country since before World War II. You know, Iran, which the U.S. has sanctioned over the past decade, is a much smaller economy, obviously, than Russia's. You know, North Korea, tiny economically. So we'd be talking about something that I wouldn't say is historically unprecedented, but I would say hasn't been seen in a long time. And the international financial system and trade webs are more connected today than they were before World War II. So I think the first thing that we'd have to say, just as sort of analysts looking at the situation, is it's difficult to predict what all of the ramifications would be of such a sanctions regime, simply because we haven't really seen it before in a comparable way. And I mean that in terms of the second order economic consequences.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what effect will it have on Sri Lanka? None that I can think of, but I have no doubt that it will have an effect on Sri Lanka and every other country in the world, mm-hmm. which is you know, it was problematic and worrisome. The second set of second order effects that I think are difficult to predict are, how do other countries and businesses respond in the short, medium, and long term, which will depend in no small part on how on the duration they expect such sanctions to be in place. So I think if such sanctions were imposed, everyone would have to assume they'd be in place for a while, simply because I think we've seen over the past decade that sanctions that are put in place are hard to lift, not impossible, but it's difficult to get them lifted. And there, I think this could well lead to a pretty substantial restructuring of a substantial part of the global financial system, and to a lesser extent, but still a real extent, trade relations, because the U.S. would structure sanctions so that they were secondary in nature, mm-hmm. i.e. they forced everyone in the world to make a choice, interact, either follow our rules or get cut off from the U.S. economy, which is how secondary sanctions work. And you know, some countries would find this decision easy to make, others would find it hard to make. The country that would find it the hardest to make would be China, which is deeply integrated with the U.S. economically in all the ways that you all know, which you know deeply resents U.S. sanctions power, but has a really ambiguous relationship with U.S. sanctions in the past. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, China has pushed back against U.S. sanctions on Iran and has sort of engaged in a kind of a long diplomatic dance where it tries to buy as much oil as it can, and the U.S. State Department kind of criticizes it, and they go back and forth. But in other ways, China's very, you know, kind of religiously followed U.S. sanctions. I think the best example of this is Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam, who was sanctioned by the U.S. I think last year, 2 years ago. It was reported by Hong Kong media was unable to open a bank account in a Chinese state-owned bank because they were refusing to deal with her. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, she's just one individual, an important one, but one individual. If we were talking about sanctions against, you know, one of the world's, you know, larger economies, that would impose far larger costs on China to deal with. And so I think China would have a really complicated set of choices that I think anyone who says they know how China would respond is you know, overstating their predictive power, because China itself doesn't know how it would respond. I think China would probably try to abide by some of the restrictions, try to resist other ones.
Well, would you anticipate a greater reconciliation between Russia and China in that case, say, or a greater realignment of interests?
Alignment, you know, I think so, but I think the key question for China would be, which sanctions can you reject with limited cost to yourself, and which sanctions do you need to follow so that the cost isn't too high? You know, China doesn't want to be cut off from U.S. technology, China has thus far been very fearful of getting cut off, having major banks cut off from the US banking system. Whether that calculus begins to shift is, I guess, the big question. But I think actually China's domestic calculus would be more important than its calculus over its relationship with Russia. And it's just very difficult to know whether China would conclude the domestic financial stability risks are so large that it's just got to follow sanctions regardless, or whether it says, let's test out how much we can push back against and see what the ramifications are. So yeah, I think this is an experiment that I hope we don't have to play. And we don't, it's hard to say with any sort of confidence how it would play out if we, end up in the disaster situation where we're taking these kind of steps.
Well, on that rather not very exciting note, I want to thank our guest today, Professor Chris Miller, and our discussant, our colleague, Professor Anna Kireva, for bringing us into this exciting world of Asia and the history of Russian policy in the East. Hopefully, our great writer, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, is proven right. And we shall be masters in the sense that Russian policy in these will eventually be successful, but I also hope it will not come at a cost of relations with the West. So thank you so very much, and hope to see everyone in February when we are about to bring our another exciting and interesting speaker with a new book. Stay with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Max, and thank you, Anna, as well.
Thank you.